Wow. Thank you, everyone, and thanks for having me in. I'm San Jose native, actually, so it's always great to be back to the state. That last speaker was an extraordinarily stirring and entertaining time, so, we'll be very much the opposite of that for now. Just because, it is a confusing time. There's kind of less to say, that's so declarative. We've seen, for the last year, and that's kind of why we always talk about the last election, the next election, the future election, because politics and elections really are driving the markets and are driving the policies that they're paying attention to. And it's kind of a mixed time right now, even though we have still, last I checked, single-party government in D.C. And in kind of a curious way, that's what markets were looking forward to at the beginning of last year. If only because we had endured so many years of gridlock, it seemed that nothing really could get done, even if there were points that both parties agreed upon. And of course, then we've had the last year of truly extraordinary tumult, nothing really kind of going the way we had originally expected. We'll just look at a couple of slides. Don't worry, I don't understand why we threatened you with all 60 or 70 slides, which do exist there. But we just, kind of use the slides to kind of elaborate on the broad themes. You don't have to pay as much attention to the overall text, just kind of the broad shapes, because the main issue that markets are paying attention to is the economic fallout from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Bill, as it was initially titled, that was passed at the end of last year. And the timing itself is so peculiar, if only because, among Republicans, there's a lot there that they agreed upon, but of course they wound up going through the Affordable Care Act and, all of the day-by-day political intrigue out of the White House. Whereas when you see the ultimate bill, it kind of wound up being a lot different from the tax reform that was talked about at the beginning of last year. When we think about reform, we're really thinking about simplification, rationalization, broadening the tax base. But the bill that was passed at the end of last year, in a lot of ways, was kind of a throwback, old school, kind of deficit finance tax cut that in some sense is temporary for several years. They did things like cut the corporate tax rate permanently from 35% to 21%, but they also, of course, had some personal income tax cuts that will be sunsetting after 5 years or so. A lot of the provisions in the bill actually wind up sunsetting over time. So, when we talk about the effect on the economy, the natural place to start with is when we talk about things like the budget deficit, because we were so worried about the deficit for such a long time. If you happen to look at the chart, that shows the deficit as a share of the economy. And, we do that because, talking about the actual numbers, it's hard to put them into the right context. $660 billion, that's such a gigantic figure. But the U.S. economy is a $20 trillion economy. So roughly speaking, the deficit last year was around 3% the size of the U.S. Whereas what do we do after the bill was passed? We wound up looking for a much bigger deficit. We're looking for $800 billion for this year, $1 trillion for next year. $1 trillion deficits are likely kind of for the time being. So now we're talking about 4 or 5% the size of the economy, which really is starting to get to kind of a point where you do consider that as a little bit dangerous. And more importantly, that's what markets are starting to consider. And that's why you're finally starting to see interest rates move a lot higher. The Fed Reserve is likely to hike rates 3 times this year and probably 3 times next year. We think that the U.S. 10-year interest rate is going to move to 3.25% by the end of this year. So consequently, we think that the markets are reacting, to some extent of the deficit concerns that are out there. And what makes these types of deficits unusual is that they're taking place in a time when we expect stronger growth. What did we do after the bill was passed was that we pushed up our growth forecast for the next couple of years. We're looking for 3% growth for this year. And if you think about the U.S. since really the end of the tech boom since 2000, that's almost pretty much double the rate that we've seen in the past 15 to nearly 20 years. We look for a similar strong growth rate for next year as well. But what we always caution is that, the reason why we look for stronger growth over the next couple of years isn't because we're taking a stance on the politics or what's the proper role or proper size of government, but it's almost like in a mechanical sense, the idea that if you do things that increase the after-tax income of the typical household, then you're going to have higher consumer spending. And if you put in elements like the immediate depreciation of capital expenditure, then you're going to have higher investment. That's not really kind of a political stance or even like a forecast. It's almost more like mechanical accounting, shifting around of the numbers, so that you're going to hear kind of a lot of dissonance in the forecast out there, because for the next couple of years, things really should be on the more positive side. We're already in an economy that has close to full employment by our measure, and now we're putting all of these tax cuts and, effectively speaking, fiscal stimulus on that. And that's kind of why you've seen a lot of the upset in the market in a strange way for these first couple of months, because they're trying to balance out the short-term effect from the long-term effect. Because when you think about the short-term effect, it seems fairly positive. If folks are looking at the chart, what they're seeing there is, what do we do to our growth forecast after the bill was passed, not just for the first couple of years, but what each bar represents is for the next 10 years. And that's a very peculiar shape that we have there, because you can see we have a big positive outlook in the near term, because that's when we're having all the positive elements from the tax cuts bill. But then when you kind of go out into the future, you have a much more negative impact. On net, it's basically a push, just slightly negative to some extent. And the main reason for that really is kind of relies both in the legislation and also the economics. And remember that the legislation is that a lot of this bill winds up sunsetting after 4 or 5 years, going out to the 10-year horizon. So the very positive effects that we expect for these first couple of years, that's not particularly controversial. Those are by legislation set to phase out once you go out 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So the legislation seems a little bit peculiar, but there's also, of course, the economics, which is now you are starting to finally see, and it's kind of tricky to say, but a normalization of the U.S. economy. And it's taken a long time. Who knew that a decade after the bankruptcy of Lehman, we'd still be talking about the fallout of the financial crisis? But only now are you starting to see interest rates move a little bit higher. And from our vantage point, we had been looking for both interest rates to move higher, but also for the dollar to move higher as well. And kind of the strange thing is that you've seen the dollar soften up for a lot of this year. But in our view, you will see the dollar eventually move a bit higher because of the effect that you're seeing on interest rates. I hope this doesn't make folks car sick if I just jump ahead a few slides here. But the main reason that we're thinking about is because when you look at that left-hand side chart there, what that shows is the unemployment rate in the U.S. going back to the 1950s. And you can see the huge spike that we've had in the past 10 years, and then the decline. The unemployment rate down to nearly 4%. As a bank, we expect the unemployment rate to fall to 3%, roughly speaking, over the next couple of years. And you can see historically that's extraordinary. But what's really interesting is that right-hand side chart, something called the labor force participation rate. Because in the U.S., if you don't have a job, but you're not looking for one, you're not counted as unemployed. And there's a sense that maybe the decline in the unemployment rate isn't all that it's cracked up to be. Maybe we're not near full employment, because it's just people dropping out of the labor market. And then you look at the right-hand side chart, which shows the participation rate. It asks, do you have a job or are you looking for one? And you see both the way that it declined so sharply in the Great Recession, but also the way that it hasn't recovered so far. And there's a sense that maybe it's just the way that the data are collected, that the unemployment rate is so low. Maybe the economy is a lot weaker than we think, and we need this type of fiscal stimulus. But that right-hand side chart is a little tricky to interpret. I think that's why our intuition, kind of fails us a little bit, because, I think our gut level tells us that when the unemployment rate falls, that's probably because the economy is doing well. Just like I think our gut tells us that when the participation rate falls, that's because the economy is doing horribly. And the fact that it hasn't risen yet means that the economy is probably doing a lot worse than we think, and that this is the right time for that type of fiscal stimulus, for those types of tax cuts. But we worry a little bit about that because we don't think that's the right interpretation of people exiting the labor market. Because when you look at that right-hand side chart, you see the explosion in the participation rate in the 60s, in the 70s, going into the 1980s. And that really didn't have to do with economic policy. It's a lot about demographics, not about the Kennedy tax cuts or the LBJ guns and butter fiscal policy or whip inflation now buttons from President Ford or any other policy like that. It's really about changing, shifting social mores. And in this case, the most important element there, and I know there's a lot of charts there, but just notice the shape on the upper right-hand side chart, is women entering the labor force. What that upper right-hand side chart shows is female labor force participation for what economists call the prime age groups, 25 to 34, 35 to 44, and 45 to 54. And you can see that goes back to the 1950s and the explosion that you had really starting in the 1960s over the next generation. And that didn't really have anything to do with Fed policy or economic issues necessarily in terms of macro policy, but because of new demographic changes. So what we always have to be kind of cautious with is thinking about the labor market. Is it really near full employment? And in our view, it actually closely is to that. There's been a lot of conversation about men dropping out of the labor force. That's what you see in the upper left-hand side chart there. That shows, again, going back to the 1950s, kind of what has happened to male labor force participation rates, again, for those three age groups. And you see kind of the same element in the past 10 years where you've had this big drop. But kind of this is why context is so important, because there's always this kind of insinuation that maybe the Great Recession had broken the U.S. economy in a way that we hadn't seen before, and that's why people are dropping out of the labor market. And you see men dropping out of the labor market, and it only kind of enhances that view. But if you look at that upper left-hand side chart, what you see is that men have been dropping out of the labor market, not just in the past 10 years, but in the past 50, 60 years. And I mean, that doesn't make it any better, but really what it does is to put the right context into it. That, to some extent, I think we associate a higher labor force participation rate as automatically a good thing, and a lower one as necessarily being kind of a bad thing. But that's exactly why you have to kind of put this thinking, into the right shape. Maybe 97% of men being in the labor market, back in the 1950s potentially might have been on the higher side. So, ultimately, demographics are a key thing in terms of thinking about the fullness of the labor market. And the most important demographic shift that we've had really in the past 15 or 20 years, has been the aging of the population. It's really, in an accounting sense, the main reason why the participation rate has fallen so much. When you look at that left-hand side chart, what that left-hand side chart shows is the share of the population, that's 16 to 24, 25 to 54, and 55 and over. So at every single point in time, the three lines add up to one, a complete mutually exclusive accounting of the population. And you can see that middle line, the share of 55-year-olds and over has gone up dramatically in the past decade, and it's likely to keep going in that direction. That's really just a lot of demographic destiny that's in place right now. So why is that important? It's important because of the right-hand side chart. Because the right-hand side chart shows you the labor force participation rate for these different age groups. If you're 25 to 54, you're in the labor market 80% of the time. If you're 55 and over, you're in the labor market around 40% of the time. And again, this kind of gets back to what is, quote, the right labor force participation rate. Because generally we think, that the lower participation rate for older workers probably makes more sense. The U.S. has collected this data for a long time, even if you go back, to the 19th century, to the pre-Civil War. Right now, our president is a man who's 65 to 74 years old, and if you look at the data right now, men 65 to 74 are in the labor market around 30% of the time. Whereas if you go back, 100, 150 years back to 1870, men were in the labor market who were 65 to 74 around 90% of the time. So, was that a good thing or not? Probably not, in our view, because the main reason for that was just because there's no such thing as retirement, back in the 1870s, right? You just pretty much worked until you died for those group of people who managed to reach 65 to 74. We think that lower rates for older people probably make a lot more sense. But what that also means is that over the years, we're likely to see the participation rate continue to fall. So the reason why we talk about this is because what it means is that the 4% unemployment rate really means 4%, that the unemployment rate really is historically low in our view. And so by pouring all of the stimulus onto the economy, what markets are really worried about is that at a time when the Federal Reserve is now raising interest rates, no longer doing the type of quantitative easing that really kind of put it in the political, kind of turmoil, and at the same time that you're probably going to have a real private demand for capital, it seems strange that, we're doing this at a time when the economy seems to be doing relatively well, certainly as measured by the overall labor market. But that's great that, folks like me or policymakers in the markets think that, we're near full employment. But generally, when I think about full employment, I would think that, workers are elated, have tons of job offers. And, it's interesting, when we talk to the bank's clients, we know, and when we also read from the anecdotal evidence from the Federal Reserve's Beige Book, that, employers are finding it more and more difficult to find qualified workers for the vacancies that they have in the labor market. But so far, at least in the data that we have, we just really haven't had that type of evidence. You look at wage growth, and we have two measures of wage growth right there. The left-hand side chart shows the average hourly earnings growth in the U.S. going back to before the crisis, and you really see kind of halting, fitfully starting evidence. But wages really haven't gone, in an accelerating fashion, such that so many workers are still genuinely, disappointed with the labor market. If you look at the right-hand side chart, which shows something called the Employment Cost Index, which also controls for salaried workers, controls for their benefits, also has things, where, they're really kind of having a consistent measure of wages over time. It tells you kind of the same story. And I think to some extent, this really explains, why there's so much antipathy towards things like international trade. Because despite the fact that by some measures we're in full employment, workers really haven't really been able to enjoy the fruits of that. Instead, what they wind up having are things like automation, international trade that seems to both threaten their jobs. And you really can't do that much about automation. You can't really fight the machine, to try to save your job for only so long. And that's why we've had kind of these outbursts when it comes to increasing tariffs, to the extent that it seems like at least some way, at least temporarily, that we can wind up protecting jobs, even if it's not on a permanent basis. But we do think, on a more optimistic side, that you will see wage growth. It's been such a long wait. I think that it's the biggest macro puzzle really over the past year, if only because, we've really kind of seen, inflation really be on the lower side in the aggregate in the U.S. What the left-hand side chart shows is inflation running at around 2%, for the past 15 years with a lot of volatility. But it's one of the reasons why the Fed was so aggressive at the start of the crisis in terms of doing quantitative easing, moving to emergency measures, because they didn't want the U.S. to fall into a deflationary trap. Several years ago when Greece was having the crises, there was a lot of conversation about whether or not the U.S. could become like Greece. And, in our view, that wasn't really kind of a likely scenario. Always remember that the U.S. is issuing its debt in its own currency, and that makes a huge difference in terms of the sustainability of that debt relative to what investors will be willing to take on. The more likely risk at the time was that the U.S. becomes a place like Japan, which has been in a deflationary twilight for the past 20, 25 years, where you have economic stagnation and a generation where they see really no hopes in terms of a higher aspiration, higher standards of living for them. Unfortunately, we think that the U.S. has managed to avoid that. But now, kind of in a strange way, we're finally starting to see kind of the relative downside to that, which is when you look at kind of where interest rates are moving. And what the left-hand side chart shows is just the 10-year interest rate generally on top and the 2-year interest rate generally on bottom. And that chart goes back to the late 1990s. And you can see kind of at the very end, both of them are moving higher along with our view, if only because you're starting to see now that normalization of the economy. You hear some chatter about, well, maybe that's a bad sign, because usually the difference between those two lines is seen as an indicator for recession. If you look at the right-hand side chart, the bars, that's what you see there. And you see kind of the way that things went negative in 2000, right ahead of the 2001 recession, or the way things went negative ahead of the Great Recession going into 2007 and into 2008. So to the extent that the lines have been moving lower over the past couple of years, we're not as worried about that. We think that recession is still considerably far ways off, even though the U.S. has been in recovery for quite a long time now. It's still not quite the longest recovery in the NBR's official recession dating history. The NBR is the official arbiter of such times. But for the next couple of years, it seems like a recession is just that much more unlikely because we're going to be enjoying kind of the benefits of all of that fiscal stimulus. But that's kind of the mixed picture that we have. For these first couple of years, it is likely to be pretty positive, but then what happens in those years after that? If you do wind up falling into recession, what type of fiscal stimulus will we be able to put down then, given that we've gone through so much of it now? kind of, especially to the extent that the Federal Reserve is hiking rates, they're doing so in anticipation of trying to get things back to normal as fast as possible. And we've kind of seen the markets react to that, both in equities, where we're still pretty positive, as well as interest rates and foreign exchange. So we just kind of want to warn about concerns in those out years, but for these first couple of years, we're pretty optimistic for the US. Let me just stop there as my time is up. So thanks very much, everyone, for taking the time. Thanks.